So, let's get into it. Last week, I took on a hell of a talk. Talked about the Eightfold Path, kind of did an overview of its entirety. And so I want to continue on this discussion on the Eightfold Path. And to introduce the Eightfold Path, they talked about like the Buddha as a spiritual physician, that he was like a doctor. And just like any doctor, you go to the doctor, you get a diagnosis for whatever illness or virus that you find yourself with, and then they give you a prescription, all right? And so Dr. Buddha diagnosed all of us with this dilemma of suffering. And it's quite natural for us to hate what is painful and cling to what is pleasurable. And then we end up in this really stress-filled unease that can be quite full of suffering. So we have this diagnosis. And so the prescription we are given is this Eightfold Path, this training process to end suffering. And so tonight I'm going to step into the first factor of the Eightfold Path, which is right view. But there are 8 factors, as I say. There's right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. And I think as the weeks play out, I'll probably have enough time to go over each of these. But for today, I want to just step into an overview of some of my thoughts on this first factor of the Eightfold Path. Right view, or Samma Ditthi in Pali. And so even just saying like right view, those 2 words kind of give me a bad taste in my mouth, right? That it sounds so almost like religious, that every religion has their thing that they consider the right view, and anybody else's views are the wrong view, and we have this like fixed views of my views are correct and your views are incorrect, and it creates like an us versus them mentality. And so we end up in this dilemma of fixed views, and it's extremely common these days to fall into these fixed views of black and white thinking. We kind of have a culture that breeds black and white thinking. You're either this way, you're either that way. You're either all good, you're either all bad. And so I grew up with like 80s and 90s Saturday morning cartoons. And anytime you watch like any of these cartoons, it's pretty clear who the bad guy is. He's like bad in all ways. He looks ugly, he's evil, he says the bad things. And to come to reality, there isn't anybody in this world that is all bad. Like, you know, Skeletor, I'm sure he has a family that loves him. Or Shredder probably donates to the community garden, right? That everybody has their qualities. But with our general attitude, we're really good at thinking this is right and this is wrong. And in this context, I don't want us to fall into that practice of looking at right view is an us versus them, right view versus wrong view. Because when we find ourselves falling into these extremes of the mind, we're not seeing things clearly. And so when I look into this word, Samma Ditthi, the traditional word, the Pali Sanskrit word for right view, I like to emphasize what right in this context means, where Samma means appropriate, means clear. One of my friends, she describes it as harmonious. And I kind of like this harmonious view. Do we have a harmonious view with the way things actually are? And so I want to keep that in mind, that this isn't an us versus them mentality, right versus wrong mentality, even though if you're anything like me, you may have been conditioned to think in these ways. And so I've gone through life with these kind of like rigid beliefs, like I'm like, you know, or have been one of those like annoying vegans. Like I've been vegan for like 20 years, right? And like, there's a certain point in my life, like I was very much isolated in my little vegan world. I worked at a vegan restaurant and went to the Buddhist retreats that serve vegan food. And like my whole family's like vegan, my sister, my brother, my wife, my brother-in-law, like my mom's even vegetarian. So I live in this like bubble. So anytime I came across like meat, my mind would be like, oh, like, those people are terrible that eat meat. How can you be so irresponsible and cruel? And it's like, oh, well, something like not eating meat can feel so wholesome, we can turn it into suffering real quickly. And so this is the complexity of right view. It isn't so much about being right. Like, yeah, sure, I think being vegan is right. It's right for me, definitely. But you know what's really not right is sitting around hating people, because that's going to equal suffering. And so we all go through in life these, what the Buddha called dead ends, that we try to see what our views of the world are. And so like in the story of the Buddha, he believed that at first in his life that clinging to pleasure equaled genuine happiness, right? He grew up to become a king, so he was a prince. And in his life of luxury, he can have all of life's pleasures because he was of this noble caste. And so he got all the great food, all the great sex, all the great entertainment anybody could like. And as he clung to this view of pleasure equals happiness, constant pleasure equals happiness, he discovered he was depressed, miserable. So clinging to that view didn't work. So what did he do? Boom, went to the direct opposite. He gave up his luxurious life and went to live out in the forest with these extreme ascetics. That they said pleasure was the cause of suffering, pleasure is sinful, pleasure is bad. And so he gave up all of his pleasure and started meditating in extreme ways, punishing his body. Wouldn't eat but 1 grain of rice a day, wouldn't sleep. So he like punished himself because he thought pain must equal lasting happiness. Pleasure is sinful and bad. And then what did he discover? Oh, he's miserable then too. And so it's often said that he discovered these 2 dead ends of extremes, right? The dead end of addiction to pleasure, and sometimes we call it the dead end of religion, of blind faith, right? And so as I introduce this like religious quality of right view, right? It's a dead end to blindly believe it. So it's like the punk rocker in me loves that, right? Don't trust authority. Don't trust it because some authority said it or it's in some old book. And in those old books that I read about this, even that old book says, don't trust the old book. It's a lesson the Buddha gave on ehipassiko. Go see for yourself. Go see for yourself. Don't trust it just because it's tradition. Don't trust it just because a great teacher said it. Go see for yourself what this right view is. And find the ways that you cling to these dead ends. Like I said, I'm telling on myself a little bit about my dead end of believing I'm righteous because I eat a certain diet, right? And so find these ways that we find ourselves lost in the corners of extremes. So the lesson on loving kindness, the Metta Sutta. And the Metta Sutta is this beautiful lesson the Buddha gave on wishing all beings ease. Wishing in gladness and safety, may all beings be at ease. Whatever living beings there may be, whether they're weak, whether they're strong, omitting none, the great or the mighty, the medium, short, the small, those seen, those unseen, those living near, those living far away, those born and to be born, may all beings be at ease. So he gives this message of wishing all beings ease. And at the end of this particular discourse of expanding our heart to be loving towards all beings, he offered a message on views. And he said, by not holding to fixed views, the pure-hearted one, having clarity of vision, is not born again into this world. By not holding to fixed views. And I love that in a message about loving kindness and a message of wishing all beings ease, he included this idea of not holding to fixed views. And how it's a loving act. Because when we do hold to fixed views, what happens? We bomb for peace. We end up acting out in violence. We think we know better than somebody else. And so loosening up on our views and seeing how we can be present with a loving heart with our views. Because we still have to have our views. The Buddha wasn't against views at all. There were teachers at the time of the Buddha that said, try not to have any views, have no beliefs, right? And I think that's kind of foolish. I don't know how you could live life with no views or no beliefs or no perceptions, right? So this is the middle way. When we find ourselves in these dead ends, have the views, but don't hold to them so tightly that you create violence. So, as we have that kind of precursor, I wanted to say these things just to make sure that we have the proper eyes to view the Dharma and the proper ears to hear the Dharma and the proper heart to practice the Dharma. So let's get into it. What is right view? And there's two aspects that we generally emphasize in this first factor of the Eightfold Path of right view. The first one would be suffering, understanding suffering and its end. And then the second one is karma. So I want to go in these two aspects of right view. And the first one, suffering and its end. So, in life, we all experience, what we say, birth, aging, sickness, death, sorrow, lamentation, grief, despair, not getting what we want and getting things we don't want so much, right? And this is what the Buddha said, dukkha. This is what this word we translate to suffering, right? But when we notice that these things that are inevitable in life, they're not necessarily the cause of suffering. It's not life so much that dictates our suffering or happiness. It's our relationship to life that dictates our suffering or our happiness. So when we meet pain with hatred, suffering. When we meet pleasure with grasping and clinging, suffering. But when we meet pain with compassion and care and a nurturing heart, no, not so much suffering there. And when we meet pleasure with gratitude and non-attachment, not so much suffering in that moment. So what we want to do is train our awareness to see the world through certain eyes. If we train our heart to be compassionate rather than hateful, that's the end of suffering. If we train our heart to be gracious and non-attaching, that's the end of suffering. And so, that leads us to the second factor that I want to kind of tease out today, is karma. And if we have the clarity of understanding where suffering is and where its ends, how do we do it? It's through this understanding of karma. Karma is a quite misunderstood word. Of any of these Buddhist words I throw around, I tend to hold back on bringing up karma because there's a hell of a lot of misconceptions about karma. Because I think it's like the pop culture karma is like the idea that if I do something nice things will happen to me. Like if I give money to this charity, I'll get that money back threefold by some cosmic force, right? If I'm nice to my neighbor, I'll end up with a nice big house someday, right? That's not necessarily what karma is. But I understand why there's a confusion, because the Buddha did this wacky thing. Karma, this idea of karma, existed way before the Buddha. And there's a few different ideas of what karma is. So the Buddha came up with his idea of explaining what karma is, but by using the same word people used for thousands of years before. So he kind of like repurposed this word karma, and now we're kind of left with like, what is this karma? So I want to talk about a Buddhist perspective of karma. And it's very simple. It's cause and effect. We have karma, which is a Sanskrit word, kamma in Pali, that means action.
What's up, y'all? Reverend Mikey Noechel here from Wild Heart Meditation Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks for checking us out. Do me a favor, please like and subscribe. And if you feel moved to leave a donation, you can do so at wildheartmeditationcenter.org or the Venmo link in the description. Peace and love.